Welcome to What's the Path to Your Profitability Goal. My name is Aphrodite Papanikolaou. I'm the Vice President of Paul Mitchell Schools, and I'll be your host for this tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about the path to your profitability goal. And I love these quotes from Anthony Whitaker. It's a business, not a school. Because a lot of us like to think, well, this is a school. And at the end of the day, realistically, it's a business. And just because we are teaching education doesn't mean it's not a business. So I also love his quote, you need to know the results of your hard work. So looking at your financials really tells you the results of all the hard work you put into it. And you have no business being in business if you're not prepared to learn the language of business, and that language is ultimately going to be about numbers. I know a lot of us tend to get scared of financials or numbers if we're not used to looking at them. But if you're going to be a business owner or a leader in your school, it's key to really understand the numbers. And they're really not as scary as you might think. So now let's look at where you are in your business life cycle. If you haven't seen a life cycle report like this, it starts with a business opening up in their startup. And typically with a startup, you're in that growth stage. And then you hit that really spiked growth stage, hopefully. And then at some point, and it could be in years or it could be quickly, that you get to the maturity stage, which means you've pretty much gotten to where you're likely going to sustain your numbers or see some future growth or possible declines. And in any business, you're going to have your up and down years. And it's really about how quickly you can identify opportunities when you are on a downward trend on how to reverse that and get back on your growth path. Always looking at adapting and reinventing yourself so that you're not just sustaining, because sustaining at some point means you may likely be declining. So always looking at opportunities to grow. So depending on where you are in this life cycle, business life cycle, most of our schools are in that maturity stage, and then they're somewhere to the right of either growing, sustaining, or declining. So hopefully that gives you kind of a visual of what that path could look like. So speaking of paths, I wanted to look at our trend over the last 4 years. The numbers you're seeing here are total revenue and the 4 main components that make up total revenue, and looking at the last 4 years of the results. Now here I'm not showing dollar figures, but I'm showing the percentage change year to year. And that faded white line will show you the average trend. So when you're looking at historical results, you want to look at year over year, but also the trend over a period of time. So in this example, we're looking at total revenue, and we're trending over the last 4 years slightly up. So now let's get into more details. So if we break down tuition revenue and kit revenue over the last 4 years, the components that make up tuition revenue include clocked hours, so your actual hours versus scheduled. Depending on what alternative schedules you're offering, that could impact the number of hours you're clocking, because a 3-day or a 4-day program is clocking less hours than a 5-day program. So that would impact your tuition revenue. Same with drops in attendance. That has a huge factor on how many hours are being clocked and the tuition revenue you're earning. Price adjustments are also important. And actually, I'll take a minute to pause there to show that if you look down at the bottom, the kit registration fees looks like has a steep decline. But when we dug into the data, we saw that the reason that had happened is a lot of schools had moved their kit dollars up to tuition. So they lowered the price of their kit, but they moved those funds or the fee up to tuition. So that's where you're seeing the difference between those numbers, when in reality the total revenue stayed relatively flat. New programs will also have an impact on your tuition. So if you're adding a barber, makeup, skin, or nail program, and those are new enrollments that you didn't have in the past, that will add to your tuition. Kit registration fees, like we talked about, if you change the price that you're charging for a kit, it will impact what revenue you're earning on that kit. Also, adding or removing items from your kit will also impact that number. So depending on what margin, if it's high or low, will show a difference year over year if you're adding, let's say, an iPad or a makeup kit, other items into the kit that didn't exist in the past. You'll see a different trend year over year. So the point of this is really to understand, not just looking at the trend and looking at the numbers, but understanding what happened behind the numbers. So now let's go on to the other 2 components of revenue, services and take home. Now here, we're obviously seeing a downward trend. The guest count that we've seen overall for most schools is down over the last several years. Same with service dollars and take home per guest, as well as the number of guests per future professional. Retention as well has been on a decline. This is an area that we're really working with our schools to get these numbers back up. So back going to that business life cycle, you know, when you look at the services and take home, we're trending in a negative direction here. So this is an area of opportunity for our schools to really improve. And really, services and take home to me is kind of the gravy for every school, because we're obviously going to earn tuition with the dollars that we're earning from the clocked hours. But you have those students in the school and they need to do services, and it's only to their benefit and your benefit to get them those guests and experience. And as they're there, they're of course going to buy take home. So there's still a lot of area of opportunity, and this is an area that we're focused on to grow the clinic. So now let's talk about the root system. The root system of a financial statement, everything's interlinked with one another. I'm showing this example of a redwood tree, and I don't know if you know too much about the redwood trees in Northern California. They're the tallest trees on earth. They're about 350 feet tall and 25 feet in diameter. They weigh a ton, or tons, and their roots, but the odd thing about them is their root system is actually really shallow. It's only 6 to 12 feet deep. So considering how tall these trees are and what they have to withstand with winds and earthquakes and fires, it's amazing that they are able to stand as tall as they do and as long as they do. But how they do that is how they're intertwined in their root system that literally holds them up. They have to actually grow very close to one another because they depend on each other for nutrients to grow. And only redwoods have the strength and the ability to support other redwood trees. And so this makes me think of our root system. You know, our financial statements are all intertwined. They're all connected to one another. Every action has a reaction. Depending on what you add or take away, it will affect your bottom line financial results. And same as our network. Our network is our root system. We grow close to one another. We help support one another through good and bad times. And just knowing other schools and getting examples of what works and doesn't work from our brother-sister schools really helps us to grow. And we look to really lean on one another. So a good example of that actually exists on the CRM. If you go under Documents and search for metrics for operating a quality school, you're going to get this root system, which is the path to profitability. In that document, it has a lot of information that I think is worth taking the time to read through to understand how all the numbers are linked to one another. So let's look at a sample P&L. Here's an example of a school over the last 5 years and what their financial results look like. So you'll see on a typical financial statement, the income, cost of goods sold, gross profit, expenses, and your net operating income broken down year over year. The items highlighted in blue are actually items I added to a typical financial statement. Most accountants will just give you the dollar figures and not the percentages, but you can ask them to add that in for you. So ask them to include percentage of total revenue so that you can see those comparisons year over year. And if you look at the items that are highlighted in green are the ones that have to do with wage. And the reason I highlighted that was that I do like to add up the wages for administrative staff, which fall under expenses. And then I look at the instructor wages and I include payroll taxes because unfortunately we do have to pay taxes. So those numbers, you can take those and compare them to your key performance indicators to get an idea of where your numbers fall in comparison to the average. And being that wages makes up the majority of our expenses, somewhere between 30 and 40% for most schools, it's a big factor to keep a close eye on. Now let's look at an example of going from the bottom up. So if we start at the bottom of a financial statement, the net ordinary income, in this example, the profit that they earned in 2017 was almost $106,000, which is 5% of their total revenue. So if this school wanted to increase their profit margin, their net operating income from 106 to 170 and keep their expenses the same, they would have to generate an additional $64,046 in income, and that's about a 3% growth. So if we kept the expenses the same and increase tuition revenue, they would have to clock an additional 6,405 hours based on a $10 per hour program. Now, the key is to understand what your hourly program rate is. I'm using in this example $10 to keep the math easy. But to you, depending on your hourly rate, you can back into how many hours are needed in order to increase the revenue based on the goal that you're trying to reach. So the combination of increasing your revenue and reducing your expenses will actually get you to that goal faster than to just focus on increasing revenue. There's always opportunity to improve expenses. So speaking of that, the items that you may want to keep a close eye on when it comes to expenses, I outlined here. So wages, for example, like we talked in the previous slide, those tend to quickly get out of control if they're not monitored regularly. Staff levels, especially overtime for learning leaders, can sometimes get out of hand if there's not good controls in place. So I always advise that as your financials fluctuate up and down, that you're planning in advance of what your staffing levels are needed. And consider when you do lose a staff member, if you have the ability to absorb that staff member into the existing team, or if it really requires hiring someone. Supplies. Supplies is actually one that surprisingly you'll see creep up before you know it. Office supplies and cleaning supplies, if not monitored closely, can get out of hand and the number could get pretty sizable. So I definitely advise that schools have systems in place to approve any orders of supplies. Inventory levels is another one. We'd recommend that regular monthly physical counts occur so that you know how much inventory actually exists in the building, not just going off of what your point of sale system is telling you. And if monthly is not possible, I definitely recommend on a quarterly basis to get the team together. And this can be a fun event. You can get your team together, hand out different lists that they have to count, and just make a game out of it. But it's important to do a physical inventory count on a regular basis. Contracts. Contracts are also important to keep a close eye on. Copier leases, merchant fees, insurance are good examples of contracts. Anything that you sign that locks you in for a period of time is considered a contract. And every year that those leases come up for renewal, I recommend that you do get competitive quotes, because you'll quickly realize that even though you might have a great relationship with your copier company, it's always good to have them compete with others. Janitorial is another one that sometimes can increase to a level that doesn't make sense. We've even seen some schools more recently actually hire a day porter that's an employee of the school that takes care of the school every day on a regular basis. But it's things like that that you want to compare if it makes sense to have a janitorial company or consider bringing someone in as staff. Advertising spends. Knowing how much you're spending and what your return on investment is. If you don't understand how to measure those analytics and matrices, I definitely recommend getting coaching from the company that is providing your advertising dollar spends, and to better understand where those dollars are going and if they're really giving you a return. Training and travel, another area that you want to just keep a close eye on so that doesn't go outside of the budget. And then the mysterious miscellaneous. And I say mysterious because we never really know what gets thrown in here. So it's always a good idea on a regular basis, if not monthly, at least quarterly, get a listing of what is in this number. Sometimes you'll find that you're paying for things that you didn't even know you were paying for, or stuff that you thought you canceled a while ago. So those are some just areas that I think on a regular basis, take a look at where your expenses are going and if it makes sense to get some competitive quotes. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for joining me for What's the Path to Your Profit Goal.